Good day to you. I had to make an unexpected trip to California, so here I am in Laguna, and it's really a good place to talk about today's subject matter, which is all about cultures within cultures. Yeah, it's about masses of people who come to another country in masses, really. It's not about an individual family immigrating, it's about groups of people coming and establishing their own culture. And last night, for example, I went to a restaurant and I was sitting there and watching a guy eating a bowl of Vietnamese food. And this Vietnamese food included, well, it was a bowl, and it was a kind of a soup inside of it. And inside that soup, they put vegetables. Yeah, we don't think of that in our culture. We don't eat that way. And these vegetables are leafy green vegetables. By the way, here's Laguna. Yeah, beautiful, a little hazy today. A little bit south of Los Angeles. So the Vietnamese meal that guy was eating last night was probably all the remains of the Hmong, which is talked about in the book. The Hmong, the Vietnamese peoples that left and brought with them lots of traditions, including animal sacrifice and worshiping ancestors. And I don't know, they came to California among other places. You can read about the Hmong in the book. But today we're going to focus on California and a little bit on Pennsylvania as we talk about cultures within cultures. And there is a name, by the way, for masses of people who do leave a country, and it's called a diaspora. I don't know if you've learned that word for the first time, D-I-S-P-O-R-A. It's where masses of people, like Jewish people or like Syrians now from the war, are leaving in mass and going to other cultures. Okay, so anyway, the book does open up with talking about the Hmong. You can read about the Hmong, and also about Koreans in Russia. We've touched on the Koreans a little bit in this class, at least South Koreans, and North Korea is very much in the news right now, with the possibility that there may be a peace deal that struck with the Trump administration. But what I'd like to move to next is the Amish culture, and I really wish I was in Pennsylvania to cover this, because I've lived sort of within the Amish culture when I went to Millersville University, which is right there in the heart of Amish country in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The Amish are also in Ohio. Originally Swiss, we think of them as German. Originally Swiss, it was a particularly religious practice that means submission to God. That's what Amish means. And among other things, they shun technology. So when you go to Lancaster County, you see Amish houses, and they don't have any electricity lines running up to those houses. And they don't drive cars. They ride in buggies. And they don't have cell phones. They shun technology. Technology is something that is against the Amish religion. They also are not expected to show pride. You know, when you're proud of something, just look at your average Facebook, Twitter, Instagram feed. How many people today are saying that they're proud of something that they did, and they're showing you? I have so many friends that will post, oh, I just ran 4 miles. I just went to the gym and worked out. I just earned such and such a certificate from my workplace. That's pride. That's against the Amish culture, so you don't find expressions of pride. When you look at the Amish, one of the strongest ethics that you see is their work ethic. In fact, that's why the Amish farms are so wealthy. They really are. Because all of the family members are expected to be working on the farm. And so you don't have to pay the family members. And they're out there all day long. They're out there plowing the fields. They're out there harvesting tobacco, which they do. They're out there working all day long because work is a very strong ethic. It's part of their activity dimension. If we look at the value orientation dimension that's talked about in the book, theorizing what people do with their time when they have activity. And also the Amish were allowed to take control of their own schooling. So they're allowed to do schooling in their own communities and not have to comply with state regulations about what's required for, core curriculum and STEM classes and all that. The Amish have won the right to govern themselves when it comes to their own schooling. All right, next the book goes on to speak about indigenous cultures. These are people who have not necessarily, well, they haven't emigrated anywhere. They just happen to be the older peoples that live within a nation, and they are, in many cases, dispersed, disintegrated, but in other cases, they are not. Here in California, for example, we often think of Mexicans as having come to California, and Mexicans having come to Texas. and Mexicans even coming into Pennsylvania, immigrants, Mexican immigrants. Well, if you know history, you know that actually where I'm standing right now, this was Mexico. Yeah, this is Mexico. And so was New Mexico, and so was Arizona, and so was a lot of states, even going on up to Wyoming. But Mexico lost those territories in the Mexican-American War. Yeah, we expanded our boundaries by taking parts of Mexico. So within U.S. culture, and particularly here in California, you have a lot of Hispanic, also indigenous peoples, people who were here before immigrants from Western Europe came. So here's a nice little park bench. Yeah, it's nice to have the use of outdoor spaces for the people. Not just always private property everywhere you go. One of the nicer things of California, you can find it in Pennsylvania to some extent too, but you don't find scenes like this. So we're talking about indigenous peoples, and we mentioned Mexico, and let's actually talk about the peoples in Mexico. There are two groups that are focused on by the book. One is the Mayans. The Mayans were a very philosophical culture, and nobody really knows what happened to them. They were on the Caribbean coast of Mexico, and the best thought is that they dispersed during hurricanes. They used to live in caves to get away from hurricanes. But they also, along with the Aztecs, the second group of indigenous peoples in Mexico, they had a profound understanding of and interest in the calendar. And they were always studying the sun and the moon and the stars to track time. It was necessary for the Aztecs in particular because you have to know when to harvest your corn. I mean, corn is everything in Mexico. It makes up the tortilla. Even the tortilla is even regulated by the federal government to make sure that poor people, if they don't have anything else, they can afford a tortilla. So you have the Mayans and you have the Aztecs celebrating, worshiping the sun. The Aztecs built the pyramids in Mexico City. And the pyramids are exactly the same dimension as the pyramids in Egypt, which are exactly on the opposite side of the world. If I remember right, I think the base of a pyramid is 28 square feet. Isn't that amazing? It's because they were using the pyramids to track the sun. If you stand on the pyramid during one of the vortexes, I think it's called. I don't know if vortex is the right word. You know, it's September 21st and March 21st when the sun crosses over into a new plane of travel. I'm not describing it like a physicist would. You can stand on a pyramid on that day and there will be no shadow cast because you're exactly in the line of sight. So Mayans and Aztecs were tracking time, really, through use of stars and pyramids and the sun and the moon. But these are indigenous peoples. And when you go to Mexico, you see people today that look like Aztecs. They look like Mayans if you go down to the Caribbean. These are indigenous peoples. They were not wiped out as they were in the United States, the Trail of Tears. They were just, well, they were brutalized. Don't get me wrong. They weren't given rights. They were brutalized by the Spanish conquistadors. But the people in Mexico are still present indigenous peoples. All right, I'd like to move on to one more indigenous set of peoples that you may not know about, and these are known as the Sami, S-A-M-I. The book talks about them as living in Norway, but in actual fact, they're really within the Arctic Circle. Excuse me, so that would include Norway. It would also include Finland, Sweden. Those countries in the very northern part, they have the Sami people living in very, very difficult conditions, very cold, and in the middle of June, it's light all year round, but in the middle of winter, it's dark all year round. In the north of Sweden, there's even a hotel that's completely made out of ice. Everything is ice. You go in there, you sit on a bar stool, it's ice. You order a glass, it's made of ice. You get your drink in it, and it has ice in it. It's an amazing concept, and that's something that the Sami first developed, because that's very normal to them, right? They're living in igloos. Why not have an ice hotel? All right, let's move now to how some cultures describe their cultures within cultures. And in the United States, we use the term melting pot, which comes from a play in the early 1900s. And this term describes how people lose their individual ethnic identities when they come to the U.S. and they become Americans. They melt into a pot, like a stew, right? The carrot eventually dissolves and joins up with the broccoli inside of the stew. And that's what we have with the melting pot concept. And although we have that idea, we do have the largest group of Americans from ethnic origin as being German Americans, and we can see that very much in Pennsylvania, a lot of German heritage all around the state. Speaking of German as a language, let's move to the idea of categorizing cultures within cultures by what they speak. So we have English-speaking cultures, which we've already identified that Britain, that tiny little island, colonized 25% of the countries in the world at one point, controlled 25% of the world. But today, 20% of the world are English-speaking cultures. And so we've got places like Ghana, which I've mentioned before. We've got Caribbean places like Jamaica. We have the United States. We have Canada. We have Australia. We have New Zealand, Britain, of course. English-speaking countries are all over the world. But then we also have Spanish-speaking cultures. And right here in California, it's very difficult to go around and not see people who are looking like they have Spanish heritage. Because of the historical reason I mentioned earlier, but also because the United States is a place that many Hispanics immigrate to. Presently, about 10% of the U.S. population is Spanish-speaking. But the number of people who have Hispanic heritage in the United States is 50 million people out of 300 million people. That's a lot of people that have a Spanish-speaking culture in their background. And there are many different ways of speaking about Spanish-speaking peoples. We can use the term Chicano. That's used to describe people who were born in the United States but have a Hispanic background. It really is used more to describe people in Los Angeles. That's where Chicano is used the most. We also have Latino. That's anybody who comes from Latin America in general. It could be Guatemala, could be Nicaragua, could be Argentina. Those people are Latinos. And then we have Tejanos. Tejanos is a very specific kind of Mexican culture within Texas. It's a Texas-American culture. So the Spanish-speaking cultures, when they come to the United States, just like any other different language-speaking culture that goes to another country, they engage in code switching. It's a form of communication where they're able to simultaneously switch between one language and another, depending on who they're speaking to. I'll be going to Sweden later on this summer to teach a class, and it's amazing to me to listen to the Swedish language. It's a very rough language. It does kind of sound like the Swedish chef on the Muppets, if you have ever seen some of those reruns. Noisy bird there. Yeah, that's the sound of the Swedish language, but you have only to say hello to a Swede, and they immediately start speaking English because they're fluent in English. So that's code switching. They're able to switch back and forth. Some interesting things about Spanish culture, just before we leave the Spanish-speaking culture behind, is they have amazing values when it comes to family. Family is everything in Hispanic culture. You don't assert your selfishness when you have somebody in need in the family. If you're a boyfriend of a girl or girlfriend of a boy and you're going to go out on a date and your mother says, but nobody is going to be here to watch your younger brother Marco, who's 5 years old. Well, guess what? In American culture, we would try and find a way for Marco not to come out on the date. But in Spanish-speaking cultures, yeah, sure, he can come along, no problem. We'll all have a great time. It's just a small example of how family is very important in Hispanic culture. And also, Hispanic culture has the highest labor participation in the workforce. Spanish speakers are workers. Yeah, they work hard. And they are the lowest welfare collectors. They're not, generally speaking, looking for government handouts. That's why, the big secret is we really like Mexican immigrants in the United States if you're a business owner, because we really appreciate how hard they work and how unfailingly they work and how cheaply they work for. One of the interesting holidays for Spanish-speaking countries, particularly Mexico, is Day of the Dead, which kind of ties in with our Halloween. Our Halloween in the United States is something that we've spread to other cultures. Europe never had a Halloween, but they do now. It's an example of culture spreading their art forms and holidays to other places. But Day of the Dead in Mexico is more about respecting and paying homage to your ancestors. So when you have a Day of the Dead celebration, you have a lot of skeleton-looking figures. I'm sure you've seen those in shops and around. And you also have pictures of ancestors, and Mexicans even serve, oh, look at this, somebody's lost a shovel down the beach, and they put it on a tree to come back and collect it. Isn't that nice? Maybe it was a Hispanic, right? Family-minded person. I don't know. At any rate, Day of the Dead, they put out food for their ancestors as if they're going to come and eat it. It's really kind of a fun celebration. Also, we want to finish up now by talking about media in the United States. Kind of an odd thing to include in the chapter, but I'm happy to discuss it because it is, after all, one of the specialties that I teach here at ESU is mass media. And we can say that here in the United States, we do have a strong media presence of Hispanic cultures. We have Telemundo, which is a television out of New York City. We have Univision, which is out of Florida. Both of those showing Spanish-speaking shows. We also have lots of radio, Spanish-speaking, along the border. We've identified earlier how Hispanic peoples, particularly Mexicans, are very, very musical. And we're predicting that there's going to be only an increase in radio stations and newspapers and television programs and bilingual movies as a result of the increasing the increase in the speaking of Spanish language in the United States. All right, so that's going to wrap up Cultures Within Cultures. I hope you have a great day.